On the 14th of July, 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out of her half-timbered house on a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music. There was no celebration. She simply began to move, convulsively, her body twisting in the summer heat, and she did not stop. She danced through the afternoon. She danced into the evening. Her husband begged her to come inside, to rest, to eat, and she could not, or would not, answer him except with more dancing. By the next morning, her feet were swollen and bleeding through her shoes, and still she danced, out into the street again, drawing the stares of neighbors who did not yet understand that they were watching the beginning of something that would consume their entire city. At first, her neighbors assumed she would simply tire and stop, the way anyone eventually stops. But hour after hour, day after day, Frau Trophäa kept moving, her arms flailing, her head thrown back, her breathing ragged, showing no sign of the exhaustion that should have long since dropped her to the cobblestones. Within a week, more than 30 people had joined her, dancing in the streets of Strasbourg with the same involuntary, exhausted violence, as if whatever had taken hold of her had reached out and claimed them too. Within a month, the number had climbed past 400. Contemporary physicians examined the dancers, checked their pulses, questioned their families, and reached a diagnosis that would prove catastrophic. They declared it a natural disease of the blood, brought on by overheated passion, the same medical framework doctors of the era used to explain everything from fevers to madness. Their prescribed cure was, by the medical logic of 1518, entirely rational. More dancing to let the excess heat burn itself out of the body. Welcome to the sinister past, where history's strangest chapters are stranger and better documented than anything you'd expect. The Strasbourg City Council, faced with a crisis that seemed to be multiplying by the day, followed the advice of their physicians and made a decision that still baffles historians 500 years later. Rather than trying to stop the dancing, they decided to encourage it, believing the sickness needed to run its course and burn itself out. Guild halls belonging to the carpenters and the tanners were emptied and converted into dance floors. Open-air stages were built in the horse market and the grain market, right in the center of the city, in full public view. The council hired musicians, dozens of them, paying drummers, fiddlers, pipers, and horn players to keep a rhythm going for the afflicted, and they brought in strong, healthy men and women to dance alongside the sick, on the theory that watching others dance safely might help burn out whatever fever had taken hold. Imagine walking into the heart of Strasbourg that summer. The air thick with dust kicked up from hundreds of shuffling, stamping feet. Drum beats overlapping with fiddles, competing rhythms clashing across the market square as musicians tried to keep pace with dancers who never seemed to tire in the way a body should. Onlookers pressed in from every street corner, some out of horror, some out of morbid curiosity, some, according to later accounts, drawn closer and closer until they too stepped into the crowd and began to move. It did not work. If anything, the council's plan made things dramatically worse. The public spectacle of hundreds of people dancing uncontrollably in the city center, framed by hired musicians and encouraged by the authorities themselves, seems to have pulled in more victims rather than fewer, as though the sight of the affliction was itself contagious, spreading not through the air but through the eyes of everyone who stood and watched. By the time the mania reached its peak, later chroniclers described a city gripped by panic as much as by dancing. Some accounts from the period claim that, as the weeks wore on, exhausted dancers began collapsing from heart attacks, from strokes, from simple physical exhaustion, some dying mid-motion in the very halls the city had built for them. Other sources, written decades or even a century after the events of 1518, claimed a death toll of 15 people a day at the mania's worst. And here is where the story gets stranger still. No surviving record actually written in Strasbourg during the summer of 1518 confirms a single death. The council's own minutes, the physician's notes, the correspondence of the period, none of it mentions fatalities directly, even as it describes the scale of the dancing in exhaustive detail. The death toll that most people associate with this event may be a detail added by storytellers writing generations later, reaching back to make an already strange event even more terrifying. What the contemporary sources do agree on is the sheer physical toll on the people still moving, feet split open and bleeding inside worn through shoes, bodies collapsing from dehydration in the July heat, only to be propped back up by the strong men the city had hired and set dancing again. Whether or not anyone in Strasbourg actually died dancing in 1518, the people trapped inside that square were, by every surviving account, suffering something that looked exactly like it might kill them. As the dancing continued through July and into August, the city council abandoned its strategy of encouragement entirely. Public dancing was banned outright, the guild halls were emptied, and in a final, desperate measure, many of the dancers who could still be moved were loaded onto carts and taken on a journey of more than 30 miles to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a martyr whom the people of the region believed could both curse a person with compulsive dancing and cure them of it. At the shrine, the afflicted were given small red shoes and led through a ritual meant to break the curse. Slowly, over the following weeks, the mania began to fade. By early September, less than 2 months after Frau Trophäa first stepped into the street, the dancing had stopped almost entirely. No one recorded exactly why. It simply ended, the same way it had begun, without explanation. Strasbourg in 1518 was not, in fact, the first time this had happened. 144 years earlier, in the summer of 1374, a nearly identical mania erupted in the German city of Aachen on the feast of St. John, and it did not stay contained. It spread along the Rhine River from town to town, reaching Cologne, then Flanders, then Metz, then Strasbourg itself, then onward into Italy and Luxembourg, as if carried by the river current. Chroniclers of that earlier outbreak noted something else worth remembering. The region had just endured catastrophic flooding, with the Rhine reportedly rising more than 30 feet, drowning fields, filling the streets with the bodies of dead livestock and leaving entire communities facing famine and ruin. The dancing, in other words, followed disaster, not by years but by mere months, in a pattern that would repeat itself again in 1375, 1376, and 1381, whenever the right mixture of hardship and fear settled over a town along that same river valley. By the time Frau Trophäa began dancing in Strasbourg in 1518, the region already had a folk memory of this affliction stretching back generations, a shared cultural belief that primed an entire population to recognize the symptoms, fear the curse, and without realizing it, begin acting the part. For centuries afterward, this episode was treated as little more than folklore, a strange medieval legend too bizarre to be entirely true. But the dancing plague of 1518 is one of the best documented mass phenomena in European history. City council records, cathedral sermons, physicians' writings, and regional chronicles all independently confirm the same basic timeline, the same scale, the same desperate civic response. This did happen to hundreds of real people, in a real city whose government tried and failed to manage it in real time. So what actually caused it? Modern historians have proposed several competing explanations, and none of them fully satisfy every detail of the case. The most widely accepted theory today is a form of mass psychogenic illness, essentially a severe collective stress response triggered by the extraordinary conditions Strasbourg's population was living under in 1518. The region had just endured a string of brutal famines. Smallpox and syphilis were spreading through the population. Heavy taxation and political instability had pushed ordinary families to the edge of collapse. In populations under this kind of sustained extreme psychological pressure, documented cases of mass hysteria, including compulsive movement, have appeared in other historical and even modern settings. Combine that stress with a deeply held regional belief that Saint Vitus could curse a person with uncontrollable dancing, and you have a cultural framework primed to produce exactly this kind of collective breakdown. One person's episode triggering a cascade of others who half believed the same curse could take them next. Modern researchers studying mass psychogenic illness have documented comparable, if smaller, outbreaks in the century since, from convulsive fits sweeping through convents in the 17th century to sudden waves of fainting or twitching moving through schools and factories in the 20th. In nearly every documented case, the pattern is the same: extreme collective stress, a shared belief system that gives the affliction a name and a cause, and close physical proximity that lets the behavior spread from person to person the way a rumor spreads, not through infection, but through suggestion. A second theory points to ergot, a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye and can produce violent convulsions and hallucinations in anyone who eats bread made from contaminated grain. Ergot poisoning is a real and well-documented phenomenon, and it has been blamed for other strange outbreaks throughout medieval history. But most historians who have studied the Strasbourg case in depth consider ergot an unlikely sole explanation. Ergot poisoning typically causes uncoordinated, painful spasms that would make sustained rhythmic dancing for days on end almost impossible, and it does not explain why the affliction spread specifically along social and familial lines, sweeping through the city street by street and household by household, rather than striking randomly wherever contaminated grain happened to be eaten. If ergot were the true cause, entire households sharing the same loaf should have fallen ill together, and strangers eating from different bakeries should have been unaffected, yet the historical pattern runs the other way, closer to a rumor moving through a crowd than a poison moving through a food supply. What remains is a case that sits at the genuine boundary of documented history and something science still cannot fully explain. Hundreds of people, in one city, over the course of roughly 2 months, danced against their own will, some until they collapsed, while the very authorities meant to protect them built stages and hired musicians that may have only made it worse. Whatever combination of fear, faith, and physical stress produced it, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's clearest reminders that the mind, pushed far enough, can do things that look less like a public spectacle and more like a nightmare taking place in broad daylight. And perhaps the most unsettling part is not that it happened once, in one city to a handful of unlucky people. It is that it happened again and again across an entire region, generation after generation, to ordinary townspeople who woke up one morning with no reason to believe that day would be any different from the one before it. Next time on the Sinister Past, on the American prairie, a family of 4 keeps an inn where travelers check in and simply never check out. When neighbors finally grow suspicious enough to look closer, what they find beneath the floorboards will turn a quiet Kansas farmhouse into one of the coldest unsolved cases in the country's history.